In the mountains of Afghanistan, where silence can mean the difference between life and death, Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan had led his SEAL team through 43 successful missions without losing a single man. His reputation was legendary, the kind of leader who could navigate impossible terrain, make split-second decisions under fire, and bring everyone home safely. But on a fog-covered morning in October 2018, everything changed in a matter of seconds. The enemy had been watching, waiting, learning their patterns. What started as a routine reconnaissance mission became a deadly trap that would test every skill Sullivan had learned in 15 years of special operations. When the first shots rang out across the valley, echoing off ancient stone walls, his team scattered according to protocol. But Sullivan never made it to the rally point. For 3 days, the most elite rescue teams in the military searched the treacherous terrain. Satellites scanned, drones circled, ground units combed every cave and crevice. But Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan had vanished without a trace, somewhere in the lawless borderlands where few dared to venture and fewer still returned alive. That's when they called her. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez wasn't supposed to be there. Women weren't officially allowed in combat roles when she first picked up a rifle, but rules had a way of bending when you could put a bullet through a quarter at 800 yards in complete darkness. The daughter of a Mexican immigrant and a Texas rancher, she had grown up hunting with her grandfather's ancient rifle, learning to read wind patterns and calculate distances before she could properly tie her shoes. Now, with confirmed kills that numbered in the dozens and a reputation that preceded her into every briefing room, Rodriguez was about to undertake the most dangerous mission of her career. Because somewhere in those unforgiving mountains, a SEAL commander was running out of time, and she might be the only person on Earth capable of bringing him home alive. The morning started like any other, in the forward operating base nestled deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan reviewed the mission briefing one final time, his weathered hands tracing the topographical map spread across the metal table. At 38, Sullivan had the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving more combat situations than most soldiers would see in 3 lifetimes. His team of 8 Navy SEALs had worked together for over 2 years, moving through hostile territory with the synchronized precision of a Swiss watch. Intelligence suggests a high-value target has been using this compound. Sullivan explained to his men, tapping a location marked in red, local Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on supply convoys. We go in, gather intel, confirm his presence, and call in the location to command. Simple reconnaissance, in and out before sunrise. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson, the team's communications specialist, adjusted his radio headset. Weather reports show fog rolling in around 0400 hours, Commander. Could provide good cover for extraction. Thompson had saved their lives more than once with his ability to maintain communications in the most challenging conditions. The man could make a radio work with nothing but spare wire and determination. Rodriguez should be our overwatch, suggested Chief Petty Officer David Park, the team's second in command. That ridgeline gives perfect coverage of the entire valley. Sullivan considered this. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had been assigned to their unit only 3 weeks earlier, part of a pilot program integrating highly skilled female snipers into special operations teams. Her file read like something out of a military recruiting poster. Top scores at sniper school, confirmed long-distance kills in Iraq and Syria, and recommendations from every commanding officer she'd ever served under. But files were one thing, and combat was another entirely. Rodriguez had proven herself quickly, though. During a Taliban ambush just 10 days earlier, her precise shooting had eliminated 3 enemy combatants who had pinned down Sullivan's team for nearly an hour. She moved through the mountains like someone born to them, never complaining about the weight of her gear or the brutal pace Sullivan set for his operations. Agreed, Sullivan said finally. Rodriguez, you'll establish overwatch on Ridge 247. Clear sight lines to the compound and both approach routes. Everyone else, standard formation. We move out at 0200. The team dispersed to make final preparations. Sullivan watched Rodriguez methodically cleaning her rifle, a custom M24 sniper weapon system that she had modified with her own scope and bipod. Everything about her approach was methodical, professional. She reminded him of the best snipers he'd worked with over the years. Patient, calculating, and utterly reliable under pressure. 2 hours later, they moved through the darkness like ghosts. The terrain was familiar to Sullivan by now. Rocky ridgelines that could slice through gear and skin alike, hidden ravines that could swallow a man without warning, and ancient paths carved by generations of travelers and fighters. Afghanistan had been called the graveyard of empires for good reason. These mountains had humbled everyone from Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union. Rodriguez peeled off from the main group at the predetermined location, scaling the steep slope toward her overwatch position with the easy grace of someone who had grown up climbing trees on her family's ranch in Texas. Sullivan watched through his night vision goggles as she disappeared into the rocks above, becoming invisible even to his trained eye. Overwatch in position, her voice crackled through their radio headsets 30 minutes later. Clear view of target compound. No movement detected. Sullivan's team approached the compound methodically. Intelligence reports suggested it was used as a safe house by Taliban leadership, but it appeared abandoned in the green glow of their night vision equipment. Buildings were typical Afghan construction, thick mud walls that could stop most small arms fire, flat roofs perfect for defensive positions, and narrow windows that made assault extremely dangerous. "Something doesn't feel right," whispered Petty Officer Second Class James Mitchell, the team's point man. Mitchell had been doing this for 12 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Too quiet. Not even dogs barking. Sullivan felt it too. After 15 years of combat operations, he had learned to trust his instincts. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up, and his gut was telling him to abort the mission. But intelligence had been adamant about the importance of this target. Too many American lives had been lost to the Taliban commander they were hunting. "Rodriguez, anything from your position?" Sullivan asked quietly.
"Negative, Commander."
"Compound appears empty, but I've got movement approximately 800 meters east. Looks like 3 individuals moving along the ridgeline. Could be shepherds," suggested Park. "At 3 in the morning?" Rodriguez's voice held a note of skepticism. "They're moving tactically, definitely armed." Sullivan made the decision that would change everything. "We proceed with the mission. Rodriguez, keep eyes on those individuals. Everyone else, standard search pattern. We're in and out in 20 minutes maximum." They breached the compound's outer wall through a gap that had been carved by years of weather and neglect. Sullivan took point, his M4 carbine at the ready. The first building yielded nothing but empty rooms and evidence of recent occupation. Warm ashes in a fire pit, food scraps that hadn't yet been claimed by insects. The second building was different. Documents scattered across a wooden table suggested this had indeed been used as a command post. Sullivan began photographing everything while Thompson established a communication relay to transmit the intelligence back to their base. That's when Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter with deadly urgency. "Commander, you've got multiple contacts approaching from the north. At least 12 individuals, moving fast. This is a trap." The first shots rang out before Sullivan could respond. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from 3 different directions, and bullets began shattering the mud walls around them. The Taliban had indeed been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. "Fall back to Rally Point Alpha," Sullivan shouted over the gunfire. "Rodriguez, we need covering fire." The crack of Rodriguez's rifle answered immediately. Through his radio, Sullivan could hear her calling out targets. "Contact eliminated, northeast corner. Second contact down, behind the stone wall." But there were too many of them. As Sullivan's team fought their way toward the extraction point, enemy fighters seemed to emerge from every shadow. These weren't the usual poorly trained Taliban fighters they often encountered. These men moved with discipline and coordination, suggesting they were either foreign fighters or elite Taliban units. "Thompson's hit!" Park's voice cut through the chaos. The communications specialist had taken a bullet through the shoulder, but was still functional. "I can make it to the rally point." Sullivan provided covering fire as his men leapfrogged toward safety. Rodriguez continued to eliminate targets from her elevated position, her shots creating crucial gaps in the enemy lines. But just as they thought they might make it out cleanly, everything went wrong. An explosion rocked the compound as an enemy RPG struck the wall next to Sullivan. The blast threw him into a pile of rubble, his ears ringing and vision blurred. When he tried to stand, his left leg wouldn't support his weight. Looking down, he could see bone through the torn fabric of his pants. "Commander's down!" Park's voice seemed to come from very far away. Sullivan tried to speak, to tell his team to leave him and continue to the extraction point, but no sound came out. The world was spinning, and he could taste blood in his mouth. Through the haze of his concussion, he could see Park and Mitchell fighting their way toward him, but enemy fighters were closing in from all sides. "Leave me!" Sullivan finally managed to shout. "Get to the extraction point." "Negative, sir." Park's response was immediate. "We don't leave people behind." But even as Park spoke, both men knew the situation was hopeless. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and Sullivan couldn't walk. If they stayed to help him, the entire team would be captured or killed. "That's an order," Sullivan screamed. putting every ounce of command authority he possessed into his voice. "Get these men home!" Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter. "I can see the commander's position. He's surrounded. Multiple hostiles moving in. Park made the most difficult decision of his military career. All units fall back to extraction. Rodriguez, can you maintain overwatch on the commander's position?" "Affirmative. I'll stay as long as possible." Sullivan watched through his fading vision as his team disappeared into the darkness. He had made the right call. 7 men would make it home instead of none. But as Taliban fighters emerged from the shadows around him, he realized his own survival prospects were essentially zero. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was the distant crack of Rodriguez's rifle, still fighting to protect him, even as his own team disappeared into the night. When Sullivan woke up, he was in a dark room that smelled of hay and animals. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and his injured leg had been roughly bandaged. Through a small window he could see it was daylight. He had no idea how much time had passed or where he was being held. The door opened, and 3 Taliban fighters entered. Their leader, a man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, spoke in accented English. "Welcome, American soldier. You are now a guest of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan." Sullivan said nothing. He had been through survival training, knew that the first hours of captivity were crucial for establishing the psychological dynamic between captor and prisoner. Show weakness now, and it would only get worse. "Your friends abandoned you," Scarface continued. "But do not worry, we have big plans for you. The world will soon know that we have captured one of America's elite Navy SEALs." Through the window, Sullivan could hear the distant sound of helicopters. His team had made it back and reported his capture. By now, every intelligence asset in Afghanistan would be working to locate him. But he was under no illusions about his chances. These mountains contained thousands of caves, hidden compounds, and safe houses. Finding one man in this terrain was like finding a needle in a haystack. What Sullivan didn't know was that 800 meters away, on a windswept ridge that offered commanding views of the valley below, Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez was still there. She had disobeyed direct orders to return to base, instead remaining in position to observe Sullivan's capture and track his captors. For the past 6 hours, Rodriguez had watched Taliban fighters come and go from the compound where Sullivan was being held. She had counted at least 15 different individuals, noted their weapons and movement patterns, and used her spotting scope to map every entrance and exit. Her radio battery was nearly dead, and she was down to her last few bottles of water, but she wasn't leaving. Rodriguez had grown up in a military family. Her father had served 3 tours in Vietnam, her brother had died in Iraq, and her grandfather had fought in World War II. The idea of abandoning a fellow soldier was simply not in her DNA. If Sullivan was going to die in these mountains, she was going to be there to make sure he didn't die alone. As the sun began to set on Sullivan's first day in captivity, Rodriguez made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was going to get him out, even if it killed them both. The search for Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan had become the largest rescue operation in the region since the hunt for Bogdal. Every available asset was deployed. Satellites repositioned to scan the mountainous terrain, Predator drones circling overhead in endless patterns, and special operations teams conducting house-to-house searches in villages throughout the valley. But after 72 hours, they had found nothing. Colonel Marcus Webb, the overall mission commander, stood in the Tactical Operations Center, staring at maps that covered every inch of a 500-square-mile area. Red pins marked locations that had been searched, blue pins indicated ongoing operations, and yellow pins showed areas where intelligence suggested Sullivan might be held. The yellow pins outnumbered everything else combined. "Sir, we've got another credible sighting report," announced Major Sarah Chen, the intelligence officer coordinating the search. Local farmer claims he saw armed men moving an injured American through the Korangal Valley yesterday afternoon. Webb rubbed his tired eyes. This was the 14th credible sighting in the past day alone. Most would prove to be false leads, but each one had to be investigated. Every hour that passed reduced Sullivan's chances of survival. "Dispatch Team Bravo to investigate," Webb ordered. "What's the status on the other search grids?" "Grids 7 through 12 have been cleared. Teams are moving on to the eastern approaches. Weather report shows another storm system moving in tomorrow night, which will ground air operations for at least 18 hours. Webb knew what that meant. Taliban fighters were masters at using weather to their advantage. If they moved Sullivan during a storm, tracking him would become nearly impossible. Time was running out. What Webb didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had been providing the most accurate intelligence of the entire operation. From her concealed position on the ridge, she had observed the compound where Sullivan was being held for 3 straight days. She had watched guards change shifts every 6 hours, noted when food was delivered, and identified the building where they were keeping him. Rodriguez's radio had died completely after the first day, cutting off her communication with headquarters. She was operating completely alone now, surviving on the emergency rations in her pack and melting snow for drinking water. The October temperatures dropped below freezing every night, and she had to fight off hypothermia while maintaining constant surveillance. On the morning of Sullivan's 4th day in captivity, Rodriguez watched through her scope as something changed in the compound's routine. Instead of the usual guards lounging around the buildings, men were actively preparing vehicles and loading equipment. They were getting ready to move Sullivan. Rodriguez had to make a decision. She could abandon her position, try to make it back to friendly forces, and report Sullivan's location. But by the time a rescue team could be organized and deployed, Sullivan would be gone. These mountains contained hundreds of potential hiding places, and once the Taliban moved him, he might never be found. The alternative was to attempt to rescue herself. It was borderline suicidal. One person against at least 15 enemy fighters, on terrain that favored the defenders, with no backup and no extraction plan. But Rodriguez had spent the past 3 days studying every detail of the compound's layout and security procedures. If anyone could pull it off, she could. As she watched Taliban fighters loading a pickup truck with supplies, Rodriguez began to formulate a plan. It was risky, complicated, and depended on perfect timing, but it might work. She would have to wait until nightfall, when the guards were tired and visibility was reduced. She would need to eliminate the sentries silently, locate Sullivan, and somehow get both of them out of the compound without alerting the remaining fighters. The biggest challenge would be Sullivan's condition. Through her spotting scope, Rodriguez had observed him being moved between buildings twice. He was walking, but with a pronounced limp. His injured leg would slow them down significantly during any escape attempt. Meanwhile, inside the compound, Sullivan was enduring his own ordeal. His captors had moved him to a different building each night, probably to prevent any rescue team from getting a fix on his location. The Taliban commander with the facial scar, who Sullivan had learned was called Ahmad, seemed to take personal pleasure in psychological warfare. "Your government has abandoned you, American," Ahmad would say during his daily visits. 3 days, and no one has come. Perhaps your life is not so valuable after all. Sullivan maintained his silence. He had been trained to resist interrogation, to provide nothing beyond his name, rank, and serial number. But Ahmad wasn't really interested in military intelligence. He was planning something bigger. "Tomorrow we begin filming," Ahmad announced on Sullivan's 4th day. "The world will see how the mighty American military treats its soldiers, how they abandon them to die in our mountains." Sullivan's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Ahmad was planning, a propaganda video that would be distributed online showing a captured Navy SEAL confessing to war crimes or pleading for his life. It was a favorite tactic of terrorist organizations around the world. That night, as Sullivan lay on the dirt floor of his current prison, he could hear increased activity throughout the compound. Vehicles arriving and departing, men talking in urgent voices, equipment being moved. Something was definitely happening. What Sullivan couldn't see was Rodriguez making her final preparations. She had waited until the compound settled into its nighttime routine before beginning her approach. Moving silently through the darkness, she used every piece of cover available. Boulders, scrub vegetation, and the shadows cast by the half-moon overhead. Rodriguez had identified 2 sentries who posed the greatest threat to her approach. The first was positioned on the roof of the main building, armed with an AK-47 and night vision goggles. The second patrolled the perimeter of the compound, making a circuit every 20 minutes. She would have to eliminate both men without alerting anyone else in the compound. Rodriguez had brought her knife for close quarters work, but getting close enough to use it would require skills she had learned during her childhood hunting trips with her grandfather. The perimeter guard was her first target. Rodriguez timed his patrol route perfectly, positioning herself behind a large boulder that he passed during each circuit. When he walked by her hiding spot for the 3rd time, she struck. Her knife found its mark between his ribs, angled upward toward the heart. The guard dropped without making a sound, his AK-47 clattering softly against the rocks. Rodriguez dragged his body behind the boulder and took his weapon. The rooftop sentry was more challenging. Rodriguez would have to climb the outside wall of the building and eliminate him without being seen by anyone inside. Using techniques learned during mountain warfare training, she scaled the mud brick wall using tiny handholds and footholds that would have been invisible to most people. The sentry never knew she was there. Rodriguez's knife struck him from behind, and she lowered his body silently to the rooftop. 2 down, at least 13 to go. From her new position on the roof, Rodriguez had a perfect view of the entire compound. She could see light coming from windows in 3 different buildings, suggesting where the remaining Taliban fighters were located. More importantly, she spotted Sullivan in a small building at the far end of the compound. Through the single window, she could see him sitting against the far wall, his hands still bound behind his back. There was one guard inside the building with him, smoking a cigarette and occasionally glancing in Sullivan's direction. Rodriguez knew she had to move quickly. The other guards would eventually notice that the sentries weren't checking in, and then her element of surprise would be lost. She climbed down from the roof and began working her way towards Sullivan's building. The guard inside was her biggest obstacle. She couldn't shoot him without alerting everyone in the compound, but she needed to eliminate him before entering the building. Rodriguez positioned herself outside the single door and waited. After 10 minutes, the guard stepped outside to relieve himself. Rodriguez was ready. Her knife struck before he could react, and she dragged his body away from the door. 3 down. Sullivan looked up in surprise as Rodriguez slipped into the building. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating from exhaustion and dehydration. "Rodriguez? What are you doing here?" "Getting you out, sir," she whispered, using her knife to cut his zip-tie restraints. "Can you walk?" Sullivan tested his injured leg. "It hurt like hell, but it would support his weight. I can manage." "How many hostiles?" "Started with 15. Eliminated 3. We need to move now. They'll discover the bodies soon." Rodriguez helped Sullivan to his feet and handed him the AK-47 she had taken from the first guard. "We're going out the back window. I've got an escape route mapped, but it's going to be rough with your leg." Just as they reached the window, shouts erupted from the other end of the compound. Someone had discovered one of the bodies. "Move, move, move!" Rodriguez hissed, practically shoving Sullivan through the window. The compound exploded into activity as Taliban fighters emerged from the buildings with their weapons ready. Flashlight beams swept across the courtyard, and voices shouted orders in Pashto and Arabic. Rodriguez and Sullivan pressed themselves against the exterior wall of the building, staying in the shadows as armed men ran past their hiding spot. They were less than 50 meters from the compound's rear wall, but it might as well have been 50 miles. "On my signal, we run for that gap in the wall," Rodriguez whispered. "Don't stop for anything." A Taliban fighter rounded the corner of their building, his flashlight beam sweeping in their direction. Rodriguez's knife took him down before he could shout a warning, but she knew their luck was running out. "Now!" she said. They ran across the open ground as fast as Sullivan's injured leg would allow. Behind them, more shouts indicated that their latest victim had been discovered. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Taliban fighters began firing in all directions. Rodriguez reached the wall first and boosted Sullivan through the gap. A bullet struck the stone inches from her head as she followed him through. They were out of the compound, but far from safe. "This way." Rodriguez led Sullivan up a steep slope toward a maze of boulders that would provide cover. Behind them, the entire Taliban force was now in pursuit, their flashlights creating a constellation of moving lights in the darkness. Sullivan's leg was screaming with pain, but adrenaline kept him moving. Rodriguez had to practically carry him over some of the more difficult terrain, her smaller frame somehow finding the strength to support his weight. They reached Rodriguez's original overwatch position, just as the pursuing Taliban fighters spread out to begin a systematic search of the area. From their elevated position, they could see at least a dozen armed men working their way up the slope below them. "We can't outrun them with your leg," Rodriguez said quietly. "We're going to have to fight." She positioned Sullivan behind a large boulder that would provide protection from multiple directions, then began setting up her rifle. The custom M24 that had served her so well during the past 4 days would now determine whether they lived or died. "I count 12 hostiles," Sullivan reported, using the night vision scope from the dead sentry's rifle. "They're spreading out in a search line." "Roger that. I need you to spot for me. Call out targets and ranges." The first Taliban fighter appeared in Rodriguez's crosshairs at a range of 300 meters. He was moving carefully from boulder to boulder, his AK-47 at the ready. "Target, 2 o'clock, 300 meters." Sullivan whispered. Rodriguez's rifle spoke once. The Taliban fighter dropped without a sound. "Target down. Next target, 11 o'clock, 250 meters. Another shot, another kill." But now the remaining Taliban fighters knew where the shots were coming from. Return fire began impacting the rocks around their position, sending razor-sharp fragments flying in all directions. "We need to move," Rodriguez said. "They'll have our position zeroed in another minute." But as they prepared to relocate, Sullivan spotted movement that made his blood run cold. "Rodriguez, we've got a big problem. Vehicle approaching from the north, looks like reinforcements." Through the darkness, they could see the headlights of at least 2 trucks making their way up the mountain road toward their position. If those vehicles contained more Taliban fighters, they would be completely outnumbered. Rodriguez made a decision that would either save their lives or get them both killed. Instead of running from the approaching vehicles, she was going to engage them head-on. The headlights of the approaching vehicles cast long shadows across the mountainside as Rodriguez adjusted her rifle scope for the longer engagement distance. She had 11 rounds left in her magazine, and at least 20 Taliban fighters converging on their position from multiple directions. The mathematics of survival were not in their favor. "Distance to the lead vehicle?" she asked Sullivan, who was tracking the convoy through his commandeered night vision scope. 600 meters in closing. I count 2 trucks, probably 8 to 10 fighters total. Rodriguez had made impossible shots before, but never under these conditions. She was exhausted from 4 days of continuous operations, dehydrated and operating on pure adrenaline. Her hands, which had been rock steady through countless previous engagements, were beginning to show the first signs of tremor. "I'm going for the drivers first," she decided. "If I can stop the vehicles, it'll buy us time." The lead truck was bouncing over the rough terrain, its headlights sweeping back and forth as the driver navigated around boulders and deep ruts. Rodriguez would have to time her shot perfectly to account for the vehicle's movement and the challenging angle. Her first shot shattered the truck's windshield, and the vehicle swerved violently before rolling to a stop. Through Sullivan's scope, they could see armed figures bailing out of the disabled truck and taking cover behind it. "First vehicle is down," Sullivan reported. "Second truck is stopping. They're dismounting." But Rodriguez's attention was already focused on the Taliban fighters who were still climbing toward their position from below. The closest group had advanced to within 200 meters, close enough that she could hear them coordinating their movements in rapid Pashto. "Contact, 1 o'clock, 200 meters, Sullivan called out. Rodriguez's rifle cracked again, and another Taliban fighter fell, but return fire was now coming from 3 different directions, forcing them to stay low behind their rocky cover. Bullets whined overhead and sparked off the stones around them. "We're running out of options," Sullivan said grimly. His own ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Rodriguez was down to 8 rounds. Even if they managed to eliminate every Taliban fighter currently pursuing them, more would inevitably follow. That's when they heard the distinctive sound of rotor blades echoing off the mountain walls. "Aircraft approaching from the south," Sullivan said, trying to spot the helicopter through his night vision scope. "Can't identify type yet. If it was an American rescue helicopter, they might actually survive this nightmare." But her optimism faded quickly as Sullivan continued his observation. "It's not one of ours," he said quietly. "Looks like a Russian-made Mi-17, probably Taliban reinforcements." The helicopter swept over their position, its searchlight illuminating the entire mountainside. Rodriguez and Sullivan pressed themselves deeper into their rocky shelter as the powerful beam passed over them. Below, Taliban fighters were waving their arms and pointing toward the Americans' location. "They're going to land and deploy more fighters," Rodriguez said. "We need to move now, before they box us in completely." But as she spoke, another sound reached their ears, the deeper, more powerful roar of American military helicopters approaching from the east. Through the darkness, they could see the navigation lights of what appeared to be at least 2 aircraft. The Taliban helicopter immediately changed course, its searchlight sweeping frantically across the sky as it tried to identify the new arrivals. What followed was a brief but intense aerial engagement as American Apache gunships engaged the Taliban aircraft. Rodriguez watched through her rifle scope as tracer rounds streaked across the night sky. The Taliban helicopter attempted evasive maneuvers, but the American pilots were too experienced. A Hellfire missile struck the Mi-17 and it exploded in a ball of orange flame before crashing into a distant ridge. American forces, American forces. This is Rescue 17. A voice crackled through Sullivan's captured radio. "We have you on thermal imaging, marking your position with green smoke." A smoke grenade landed 20 meters from their position, filling the area with thick green smoke that would be visible to the rescue helicopters but not to the Taliban fighters below. "Rescue 17, this is Lieutenant Commander Sullivan." He responded into the radio. 2 American personnel at the smoke, multiple hostiles in the immediate area. "Roger that, Commander. Gunships are engaging hostile positions now. Stay low, this is going to get loud." The Apache helicopters began systematically eliminating Taliban positions with chain gun fire and missiles. The mountainside lit up with explosions as years of advanced military technology met centuries-old guerrilla tactics. It wasn't even close to a fair fight. Within minutes, a Black Hawk helicopter was hovering overhead, its crew chief preparing to lower a rescue basket. But as Rodriguez and Sullivan moved toward the landing zone, a final challenge emerged from the chaos below. Ahmad, the scarred Taliban commander who had held Sullivan prisoner, appeared through the smoke with an RPG launcher on his shoulder. He was positioning himself for a shot at the rescue helicopter, and neither the Apache pilots nor the Black Hawk crew had spotted him. "RPG, 9 o'clock, Sullivan shouted into the radio. But the helicopter noise was too loud for his transmission to be heard clearly. Rodriguez saw the threat at the same moment. Ahmad was less than 100 meters away, well within effective range of his rocket-propelled grenade. If he fired, he would almost certainly destroy the Black Hawk and kill everyone aboard. Without hesitation, Rodriguez swung her rifle toward the new target. It was the most important shot of her life, not just for her own survival or Sullivan's, but for the helicopter crew who had risked their lives to rescue them. Ahmad was raising the RPG launcher to his shoulder when Rodriguez's bullet struck him center mass. He dropped the weapon and fell backward, but Rodriguez couldn't tell if he was dead or just wounded. She kept her rifle trained on his position as Sullivan limped toward the rescue basket. "Rodriguez, move!" Sullivan shouted over the helicopter noise. But Rodriguez had spotted movement near Ahmad's body. The Taliban commander was still alive, reaching for a hand grenade attached to his belt. Even wounded, he was determined to take the Americans with him. Rodriguez's final shot ended Ahmad's life permanently. The grenade rolled harmlessly away from his body as she finally sprinted toward the rescue basket. The extraction took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. As the Black Hawk lifted off and banked toward friendly territory, Rodriguez could see Taliban fighters emerging from caves and hidden positions throughout the valley. There had been far more of them than she had realized during her 4-day surveillance mission. "How did you find us?" Sullivan asked the crew chief over the helicopter's intercom system. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's position had been marked by one of our satellites," the crew chief replied. "When she didn't return to base with the rest of your team, Command figured she might still be in the area. We've been searching for both of you for 4 days." Sullivan looked at Rodriguez with new understanding. She hadn't just rescued him from Taliban captivity. She had disobeyed direct orders to remain in position for 4 days, sacrificing her own safety to maintain surveillance on his location. Without her unauthorized decision to stay behind, he would never have been found. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. Rodriguez was silent for a long moment, staring out at the moonlit mountains falling away beneath them. "My grandfather always told me that you never abandon your hunting partner, no matter what." Seemed like the same principle applied here. As they approached the forward operating base, Rodriguez could see the entire facility lit up with activity. Medical personnel were standing by to treat Sullivan's injuries. Intelligence officers were waiting to debrief them both, and what looked like half the base had turned out to welcome them home. But Rodriguez's thoughts were already turning to the after-action reports she would have to write, the questions she would have to answer about her decision to disobey orders and remain in position. Saving Sullivan's life had been the right thing to do, but military bureaucracy didn't always see things that way. Sullivan seemed to read her thoughts. "Rodriguez, I want you to know that I'll be recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. What you did out there went beyond the call of duty." The helicopter touched down gently on the base's landing pad, and medical personnel immediately surrounded Sullivan to assess his injuries. Rodriguez watched as he was loaded onto a stretcher and wheeled toward the base hospital. Colonel Webb approached as Rodriguez was collecting her gear from the helicopter. "Staff Sergeant, I need to speak with you immediately." Rodriguez straightened to attention, preparing for the disciplinary action that was almost certainly coming. Disobeying orders was a serious offense, regardless of the outcome. But Webb surprised her. "I've just gotten off the phone with Pentagon," he said. "They want to know if you're interested in joining a new special operations unit they're forming. Seems your performance over the past 4 days has attracted some very high-level attention." 3 months later, Rodriguez stood on a stage at the Pentagon as the Secretary of Defense pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to her uniform. It was the nation's second-highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat situations. Sullivan, who had recovered fully from his injury, stood in the audience watching the ceremony. His own recommendation letter had emphasized not just Rodriguez's marksmanship skills, but her tactical judgment, her ability to operate independently under extreme stress, and most importantly, her refusal to abandon a fellow soldier, regardless of the personal cost. The medal citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez voluntarily remained in hostile territory for 4 days to maintain surveillance on captured American personnel, then single-handedly conducted a rescue operation that resulted in the successful extraction of a fellow service member. Her actions demonstrated the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Army. After the ceremony, Rodriguez and Sullivan met privately in a Pentagon conference room. Both had been reassigned to classified special operations units, and this might be their last opportunity to talk openly about what had happened in the mountains of Afghanistan. "I never properly thanked you," Sullivan said. "If you hadn't stayed behind, you would have done the same thing," Rodriguez interrupted. "Any of us would have." "No, Elena, what you did was something special. You saved my life, but more than that, you proved that the bonds between soldiers transcend everything else: gender, politics, military bureaucracy, all of it. When it really mattered, you were there." Rodriguez looked out the conference room window at the Potomac River flowing past in the distance. Somewhere out there, other soldiers were facing their own impossible situations, making their own life and death decisions in places most Americans would never hear about. "I just did my job," she said finally. "No," Sullivan replied. "You did something much more important than that. You kept faith with a fellow soldier, even when it meant risking everything. That's not just doing your job, that's living up to the highest ideals of military service." As they prepared to part ways and return to their respective units, both Rodriguez and Sullivan knew that their lives had been changed forever by those 4 days in the Afghan mountains. They had seen each other at their absolute worst and absolute best, had depended on each other for survival in ways that few people would ever understand. The official military records would show that Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan had been captured and subsequently rescued during a special operations mission in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez would be listed as having provided critical support during the rescue operation. But the real story, the story of a woman who refused to abandon her post, and a man who learned that heroism could come from the most unexpected places, would live on in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it. In a military culture that was still adapting to the integration of women into combat roles, Rodriguez had proven that courage, loyalty, and tactical excellence knew no gender boundaries. Years later, when Rodriguez was asked to speak at military academies about her experiences, she would always emphasize the same point: the mission always comes first, but you never leave a fellow soldier behind. It was a principle her grandfather had taught her during childhood hunting trips in Texas, and it had saved both their lives in the mountains of Afghanistan. The SEALs had lost their leader, but they had also discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source, and that the bonds forged in combat are stronger than any obstacle the world can place in their path. The SEALs lost their leader. Then the renowned woman Sharpshooter rescued him.